All right, next up, let's talk about the alumni interview process, right? So, first of all, I do want to preface this by saying not all colleges actually provide an interview. In fact, because of COVID, a lot of colleges have since moved away from having alumni interviews. But there's still a fair number that do. And oftentimes, in this case, it's not something you need to proactively try to sign up for. For the vast majority of colleges, if they do have alums in their area in your area that can interview you, then they will go ahead and send in your application. And there's usually what's called an interview chair that's in charge of your local region, who would then try to match the local alumni interviewers with people in your area, right? And one of the little sort of like secrets in the admissions process is that unlike job interviews, which typically signal more interest on the part of the school, college interviews are not done the same way. So it's not just because like, oh, I got an interview and my friend didn't, that you have maybe better odds than your friend. That's not necessarily true, or vice versa, right? Oftentimes, it's just really how early you submit your application. So, pro tip here, if you can submit your application at least a couple of weeks before the deadline, especially for private schools, which are more likely to offer these interviews, then you just gave yourself a much better chance of maybe securing an interview. And this is especially important if the interview plays to your strengths, right? If you tend to be someone who is a little bit more sociable, outgoing, or articulate, and can use those opportunities to highlight your strengths in terms of accomplishments in various activities, then of course the interview can be a tremendous boost in terms of your chances. Okay. So a solid interview, though, is also same situation as the recommendation letters. Themselves will not be a make or break, right? A solid recommendation letter can, best case scenario, play the same role as a stellar recommendation letter from a teacher or counselor, right? So, of course, this will also vary from institution to institution. Some schools, the interview has a pretty big role, like notably MIT puts a lot of weight in their interview. Some other schools, they do have an interview, but it's largely informational, like Cornell, right? So you don't have to get stressed out if someone contacts you for Cornell because it's largely for you to get more information about the school. They're not there to rate you or evaluate you. Okay. So, of course, you could look at the website of each of the schools on your college list to see what the policies are and what the expectations are for the college interview, because it can vary tremendously from college to college. Okay. So ultimately, interviews might look like they're a little bit lower up on the scale, right? Just because they know that the interview is typically an optional part, and some students may not always fare well in the interview process. So they don't want to put too much weight on it, and rightfully so, in my opinion. But it's definitely still an important part in the process. And given that the field is so competitive, the interview itself, even if it's not as important as some other factors, can be part of those crucial tiebreakers that can distinguish you from other people, right? So in and of itself, it's not going to make or break anything. But if you want to give yourself every edge to be able to help your chances to get in, then of course you do want to up your game and really try to impress your interviewers. All right, so let's take a look at some of the questions that you might ask. This is from that same college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So when they're looking at your academic criteria, oftentimes based on the questions they ask, they will decide what your intellectual level is, right? So oftentimes they do want to see that you have truly original ideas, right? So that's why they said here, genuine scholar, near perfect scores and grades, combined with evidence of original scholarship, right? So if you can show yourself to be someone who has your own brilliant ideas instead of just simply parroting what your teachers and whatever, mentors you have tell you, that's going to be more impressive for top colleges. So oftentimes, I tell students who are applying to this Cambridge, Massachusetts college, you could take a look at some of these key things so you can see some institutional preferences, right? So for the school, love of learning, intellectual curiosity, and intellectual originality are some of the key things that in the interview process they're trying to figure out about you, right? So it's especially valuable to be able to kind of like highlight these when you're doing the college interview. Okay, so the activities, we already took a look at that, right? But some top schools like the Ivy Leagues or Ivy Plus schools will sometimes have what's called the personal qualities category. So based on the interview, they try to see whether or not there's certain kind of characteristics that you display. Some of the characteristics that this college values, for example, are openness to new ideas and new people, right? Because some of these top schools, you're going to be exposed to people from different walks of life who may have different ideas and viewpoints as you. So showing that you can fit into a community like that based on the answers that you gave can be a really solid way to show that you belong in that community, right? Same thing too with contribution to college life. That's of course a little bit vague, but if they can see from your interview that you have a lot to contribute based on like whatever your major is, or you're truly someone who is, I guess, a difference maker in your high school community or someone who brings people together, those could be really attractive qualities for colleges, right? Of course, there's also what kind of a roommate would this student be? You're probably no stranger to the fact that like Stanford has want that as one of their essay prompts because they do want to see that you will fit into the community, that you're not going to be someone who's a little bit more isolated, that you're going to be someone who engages with your classmates, your peers, right? So, of course, there's a laundry list of other categories or qualities that they're looking for here. This will vary from college to college, but essentially, this is all part of what we call your character, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later when we talk about the essays. Okay. All right, so some common mistakes to avoid during the interview process. Just want to give you some tips, especially for some of you who might be doing interviews pretty soon. First of all, really important, be punctual. Don't come late to the interview, right? I mean, some people will have greater tolerance of this than others, but some of these alumni interviewers are very busy working professionals. So you do want to respect their time, right? Because you may be like that window of time they have in an otherwise busy workday, and if you come in late, that might actually impact their actual workday, right? So do be aware of that, be respectful of the person's time, because keep in mind, these people are doing this voluntarily, right? So I'll talk about that and why that's important later on as well. Okay. The next one, of course, it's important to be prepared to talk about yourself and your interest in the school, right? If you come in there and not know a lot of details about the school, you don't even know what majors are available, then you look like you're not as interested, right? That's definitely not a good look. Okay. So if you do ask questions to the interview, don't ask things that you can easily Google, right? Try to focus more on that person's experiences in that university. I think that's going to be pretty important. Or things that would be a little bit more nuanced, like, how their education might have impacted their career trajectory, for example, right? Don't be rude or disrespectful. I don't think I need to say any more than that. That's pretty self-evident. Don't be distracted and play with your cell phone, right? So, especially these days, it's so hard for teenagers to sort of like detach from their phones. Please try to do that for the full 30 minutes or hour that you do your interview as best you can, okay? Unless it's truly an emergency, right? Next is it's really important. Don't forget to thank them. Like I said, they are doing this out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing this voluntarily. Well, actually, all alumni interviewers, I think, are not paid to do this, right? I don't know of a school that pays their alumni to do interviews, right? So they're really just doing this because they care about their school and they want to help out in some way. Okay. And lastly, here, don't forget to practice, right? So if you can get a list of sample interview questions, HS2 has a list of our own that we give to our students, but I'm sure you can find content out there on the internet that will allow you to at least practice in a few questions with a friend or with a parent, right? I think that's a really important part of preparing for these interviews so that you're not like unduly nervous because you've never done this before. Okay. Some recommendations for the interview process. So if you feel that an interview can benefit you, definitely try to take advantage, right? It is an optional part of the process. But if you choose to turn it down, some colleges might think that you're not as interested in the school, but I think most colleges know that like not to count it against you if you choose not to do the interview. Okay. So the most important ingredient here, of course, is practice and preparation. What I told you earlier, try to practice with sample interview questions so you can hone those skills a little bit before you dive into that interview. Okay. You also want to find out whether or not this is an evaluative process or an informational process. So like Cornell, like I mentioned earlier, it's not really something that they mark you and rate you in the same way that this other school does. Okay. So know what you're getting into, basically. And ultimately, this is definitely something where if you can get the advice and feedback from a professional like an HS2 counselor, if you don't feel like you project well in an interview, like you just get unduly nervous and you get like, anxiety about talking to strangers, you can turn it down, but just know that it might suggest that you're less interested in the school. But if you feel like the risk of you like giving a bad impression at interview is worse than actually turning down the interview, then of course that's your prerogative. Okay. All right. Last but not least, and the main factors that I'll be looking at here are your college essays. This is the biggie. This is the one that, of course, is going to be a big part of what you'd be spending, your preparation on in the weeks, even months leading up to the actual submission of your applications, right? All right, so let's take a look here. The first thing I want to talk about here is where does this factor in? So I mentioned that part of what they're looking for these soft factors, especially the essays, are your character. They're looking for positive character attributes. And so just below those hard factors we talked about is really the essay, the writing sample, because this is really your face to admissions offices, right? This is a chance for them to hear about you in your own words. You craft the narrative. You decide what you want to say about yourself to these admissions offices, right? So yeah, I think this is pretty critical that you want to be able to put a spotlight on these qualities that you bring to the table, right? So, as part of the admissions process, character is pretty logically mostly looked at through the content of your personal statement and other essays. But other factors include things like the recommendation letters, the nature of the work that you do for your extracurriculars, and to a lesser extent, the interview as well. Okay. So, what is meant here by character? What are these colleges looking for? Well, largely, it could be summed up in certain qualities. In this case, qualities like resilience, curiosity, perseverance, respect, and kindness. But it's also how you interact with other people, right? Are you compassionate? Are you open-minded? So in large part, you can group these main different traits into two main boxes or categories, I guess, right? So you could say it's mostly about your ethical character. Are you a good person? Do you have empathy for other people and compassion for other people? Or there's also your performance character. How do you deal with setback? Are you resilient? Are you hardworking? Are you someone who can get through various adversities, right? So those are some of the qualities that they tend to look for in the application process. So not surprisingly, when you're writing your essays, definitely try to demonstrate this character in your essays. Like I said earlier, this is your face to the admissions offices, right? The essays are evaluated not just for the content of what you say, but also how you say it. In many ways, this is also a gauge of your writing ability, how well you articulate yourself at the college level eventually. Okay. Um, so when you're selecting the topic for your personal statement, it's important to look for topics that you feel will highlight your strengths. Okay. So if you want to bring to the forefront your leadership ability, okay, how you interact with your peers and how you can actually bring the best out of the people that you lead in various organizations and schools. And of course, that would be a pretty logical place for you to start when you're writing your essays. Okay. If you are very much more of a mentor figure and you like to guide people behind the scenes a little bit more, and you relish in teaching other people, then of course that could also be another logical place where you can write a stellar essay. Okay, so there's multiple ways that you can impress the admissions offices, right? Okay, so of course, it's really important to remind yourself that the essay should focus on you. Some students may feel that, like a topic about writing like a mentor or maybe a family member can be a way to shed light in terms of their own unique experiences. But when you do that, make sure that it's not really about them. The main focal point of the essay still has to be about you and your experiences and how those people shape you ultimately. Okay. You also need to make sure you avoid some cliche essay topics. There's some essays that are a little bit more commonly written about than others. The sports triumph essay, I often like to call this the Rocky essay, where it's a very predictable narrative talking about like how at first you weren't very good, you failed, you didn't make the team or something, but you worked hard and came back strong. Now, of course, don't misread that as me dismissing those experiences, but if the story arc of your essay seems like it's very predictable like that, then it kind of might blend in the minds of admissions officers with other essays that they've read that have a very similar structure. So the onus is on you to go ahead and try to find an original way to spin those insights to make it more fresh and unique for the admissions person. Okay. Tragedy essays. Oftentimes, there are a lot of like advice things on TikTok and Instagram these days about like how do you get to this college and that college. And unfortunately, there's like a prevalence, I guess, of sample essays that talk about people's like sob stories or hardships or crises. Well, not to disparage those situations because those could obviously be very foundational in terms of what a student goes through. I'm not saying that you shouldn't write about bad things that happen in your life. The problem, though, is that the advice that I'm hearing sometimes is it's focusing more on like the pathos of those situations, right? Talking about like how feel sorry for me because bad things happen to me. I'm sorry to break it to you, but colleges are not going to accept you just because you had bad things happen to you, right? They are, however, interested in how those events might have shaped you as a person. For instance, if, let's say, an illness or a death in the family has helped mold you into someone who's more responsible, compassionate, or caring, did you sort of pick up the slack and help, your family in a tough situation, right? Those are things that the college would be interested in finding out more about, rather than focusing on the more of the tragic aspects of the narrative that you want to talk about. Make sure that it's also equally, if not more so, focused on your transformation, how you evolved and grew from said tragedy or hardship. Okay. All right. So I don't necessarily want to go through more of these. You get the gist here in terms of essay topics that are a little bit more predictable. Now, ultimately, this is really important. The essay needs to be true to who you are, right? So don't try to be someone you're not in these essays. So if you're not naturally humorous, don't, this is a bad time to try to experiment with your sense of humor because it could fall flat with admissions people, right? Now, conversely, if that's really who you are, right? You're a little bit of a jokester, or, you're the life of the party or something. You should try to lean into those strengths in the essay, right? So it's really important at this stage. Admissions people have gotten good at spotting a fake, right? So when you read through this essay, you need to make sure that this essay genuinely sounds like you when at the end of the day. Okay. All right. Now, finally, I do want to talk a little bit about what the committee process looks like. How do all these soft factors get incorporated and evaluated in a college application season? So I want to draw your example to Princeton as an example here. They go through 4 phases in their committee system when they evaluate an application. So they will normally assign first readers, is what they call them there, who are usually student interns, so like a college junior or senior, typically seniors, right, to evaluate the application first and rate them from unlikely, only if room, strong interest, or high priority. So that there's a range there in terms of how they decide, to rate them. Then they pass it along to 2 admissions readers who were then like the full-time staff members from Princeton in this case, right? Who then rank the candidates on a scale of 1 to 5 on various categories like their academic, extracurricular, or personal factors, right? After that point, people that they want to pass along to a regional committee or subcommittee are then evaluated with a larger group. It's not just the 2 readers anymore. There's going to be a larger group, maybe somewhere along the lines of like 6 to 10 admissions people from a broader area will then do the read to try to see, what they want to prioritize in terms of the incoming class, right? Then finally, the tough final cuts are then passed along to the final committee meeting, where the entire admissions office will then be making those crucial decisions as to who they decide to get in. Okay. After that, the final cuts are made. They will then decide to either admit you or defer you or waitlist you or deny you, which is unfortunate. And that would be the end of the road for the application if you're denied. Okay. And oftentimes this process will take place, the final cuts, the final committee meetings will typically take place around December for if you're applying for early action, in this case for Princeton, or around March if you're applying for regular decision. Okay. So what are some takeaways? Why is this important? First of all, it's important to realize that admissions isn't a science, right? So there's no AI algorithm who determines or who decides who gets in. Admissions is really more of an art form, right? It's a very human intensive process. Like the admissions people that I went to school with in grad school, admissions people I still keep in touch with, that basically say, yeah, I mean, they could really, there's no right or wrong necessarily. They can make the same decisions multiple times, and you can have like 3 or 4 different compositions of classes, and they'll all be equally strong academically, right? They really just want to put together a class where they feel like it is something that's a balanced class where students can learn from each other and benefit from each other and have varied interests, right? So that's a really important part of the process, right? So it's important for you to humanize yourself in this process, right? So that's the reason why these soft factors are important, because you want them to get to know you as a person. You want them to root for you and be able to vouch for you in a committee meeting with other admissions people who may have their own people that they're trying to like further or try to advocate for in the admission process. Okay, so all in all, this is why the soft factors are important, because this is a way for you to show yourself as someone who deserves to be there, but also someone that they can really know has the traits, the values, and the qualities that fits whatever type of admissions class they're eventually trying to form. Okay. All right. So with that, I do want to talk to you about HS2 a little bit here. So we've been doing this now since 2002. We've been highly successful in many, many years of helping guide students into just about every top college out there. And it's because we have a tried and true system that takes you from every step of the way, from developing individualized strategies to helping you select schools and majors and helping make sure that your application is solid in every aspect, right? Down from finalizing your personal statement to every single supplemental essay, all the way up to making sure that we can help guide you to making a smart decision as to which college you will eventually go to. Okay. And our success really bears this out in terms of why our system works and the quality and care that our counselors provide in terms of making sure that our students' individual strengths are highlighted in the process, right? So over the last 10, 11 years or so, you can see across the board from a lot of top schools, we've gotten so many people into some of the best colleges out there. And it's a testament to the hard work of our counselors, but also really about making sure that our students can maximize their chances of success in this process. Okay. All right. So with that, I do also want to let you know that some of you may have already attended the seminars for FAFSA that Stephen, our wonderful financial expert, has guided students through, right? So there are a couple more of these sessions coming up next Friday and Saturday, right? So we have a Chinese session for what's called the CSS profile. Now, this is a supplementary financial aid form for a lot of private schools, but some public universities as well, that is through the College Board, okay? And so oftentimes this is even more confusing than the FAFSA because the CSS profile has all these additional questions. So it'd actually be a really good thing as if parents are in the audience that are filling this out, or if you're a student, you can let your parents know about this. If you're a senior right now and they'll be going through the college application process and you are going for financial aid, it's probably a smart call for you to go ahead and sit in on this to learn more about the CSS profile and any sort of advice or strategies that Stephen can help you learn about in this process. Okay, so with that, solid about 10 minutes to answer some of your questions. I'd like to open up for Q&A. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so we already have quite a few. Let's get right to it then. Okay, so let's dive in there. So our first question of the evening is, rumors are starting next year. Essays will not be required in the college admissions process. Your take on this? I have not really heard of any of these rumors, right? So that is, like you said, rumors, right? So this is definitely something that colleges would have notified counselors and admissions professionals about this. This is definitely not something that would be a 1 year thing where they would do it right away. And it's honestly, it's going to be frankly really, really difficult because the essays are probably the biggest soft factor, right? So I don't put a lot of stock in that. There's a lot of rumors typically from the admissions process. So don't necessarily think that just because someone said that there's any like real stock in that for the most part. Okay. Next, I'm advanced in math and took AP Calculus BC test in May this year before taking course at school, so that I can take some post-AP courses at community college. With that said, would you recommend me to take the AP test again in May next year after the course is completed at school? I heard displaying the AP test score that was available before taking the test looks bad on college applications. No, I mean, if you've already taken it and gotten a passing score, then no. Because then if you do take those post-AP community college classes, how would you explain how you got into those classes? So it's not necessary, especially if you already got a really high score, right? Um, no, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because there are times when those courses are the only classes you can take, right? So in the grand scheme of things, AP tests are, if you were to take a look at that what do you call this? Chart that I showed you, AP tests are like the least important part of the college application process. So no, don't worry about that, right? So if you've already taken it and gotten a good score, there is absolutely no need for you to retake that. That just seems like a kind of big waste of time to me, right? Next, for volunteering, can I ask someone that I help out with instead of a supervisor for recommendations? Um, it can be like if it's a peer, maybe, but it's not, it's preferred that it's going to be an adult who sees you in a more supervisory capacity. It doesn't need to be the head person. but it's preferred that it's someone who can evaluate you from a more adult perspective, I would say. But if there's someone who knows you pretty well from that perspective, I suppose it's certainly not as bad as someone who doesn't really know you at all, but is in a supervisory capacity. I would say if there's time, really just try to get to know or try to talk to the person who's in a more supervisory capacity. I think that would be the way I'd prefer you to go. All right, next. At a big public school, the high school counselors and even teachers may not be able to write stellar recommendations. Would that be a problem? How do I address this concern? Yes, that's always a concern for larger public high schools. So it's important for you to really work on that process earlier and really try to get to know your teacher and school counselor. Um, Colleges, of course, will know that, and they'll give you the benefit of the doubt in terms of like if they know the school, that counselors may not always know the students. Sometimes there are even switches in terms of who's going to do your rec letter at the last minute, right? That's kind of unfortunate, but try your best within your control to really try to get to know these people, even senior year. If you can find opportunities to talk to your teachers and talk to your school counselor, there is still time typically for them to be able to learn things about you. You can also write a brag sheet, is what we call it, right? So in addition to a resume, sometimes if you give them a questionnaire if they have one, and if you actually strategically use that well, you can impart information about yourself to them in this process that they can use in a way to highlight your strengths a little bit more. But sure, at the end of the day, that is something that's a bit of a difficulty with much larger schools. So you'll have to work even harder to try to, I guess, try to address those potential drawbacks from the process. Okay. Next up, my intended major is math, and I will select the AP Calculus B teacher for sure for recommendations. However, for the second teacher between AP US History and AP Physics 1, which one is better? Um, I would say if you are like whichever one of those two is the stronger recommendation letter in terms of which teacher knows and likes you the best would be the tiebreaker. But if they're both equally strong, maybe having the AP US history teacher there as a counterbalance would probably be a pretty good idea, just because it would allow them to see how you would thrive in the school in other capacities. Because even if you're a math major, you still have to take writing related courses. You have to take a freshman writing class, for example, right? So showing that you can excel at social sciences can still help show colleges that you are, much more versatile and can thrive in a college environment. So if the physics teacher is a stronger one because they just know you better or you did better in the class, then just go with that. But if it's about the same strength, like I said, just go maybe with the A push teacher. Okay. Next, could you talk about applying to Johns Hopkins University's BME program? Is it better to apply ED? Is it harder than Stanford or Caltech REA? If not accepted to BME, can one still be accepted to the school? It's not an all or nothing proposition. If you're not accepted to BME, they may consider you for another major. But obviously, it's going to be a little bit harder to apply to Johns Hopkins. Is it harder than Stanford or Caltech? No, no, absolutely not. Right? Caltech has like the lowest application acceptance rate. So certainly not at that competitive. It's not quite at that level. Okay. So it's still pretty competitive, but I would say for sure Caltech is probably right now acceptance rate wise, statistically, the hardest to get it to. Okay. Just because it's so small, they don't have as many spots available. Right. Next, for essay writing, does it have to be a reflection of my extracurricular activities or it can be about a reflection from a random event? No, there's no reason why it has to be about an extracurricular activity, right? If there is an important event in your life that didn't necessarily happen in the context of an extracurricular activity, absolutely. If that event can shed light in terms of your strengths, um, it could be even a single afternoon, a chance encounter with someone, right? It does not have to be because that's also the risk of writing about an activity is it can end up becoming more about the activity than about you. So that's a potential pitfall if you're writing, let's say, for example, a football essay or a DECA essay, right? If you're ending up using that space to talk about more like what you did rather than who you are, then it becomes less effective, right? It becomes a missed opportunity because then they can't find out a little bit more about who you are as a person and what your values and strengths are, right? Next up, what is the main theme thread in the application? What is the second thread? Okay, well, I mean, generally speaking, you do want to have a little bit more of an emphasis to your application, and it's largely based on your overall strengths, right? There's not a one size fits all thing, much the same way that I told you colleges look to assemble a pretty diverse class. whatever that main theme is for your essay needs to be tied into what your passions and interests and strengths are and what you've managed to do in terms of your activities. So there's not really an easy way to answer that question because it's a very individual thing, right? So it's important for you to look at what it is that you're most passionate about. Is there something that unifies or ties in your various activities in a way that you can articulate, something that you want to do in college or beyond? I think that's maybe the direction you want to look at for that. Okay. Next, can a different Common App essay be used for different schools? Yes, but I typically don't recommend it because, well, first of all, these Common App essays are not supposed to be school specific anyway. Okay. Um, and two, by the time you're getting to certain stages in the application process, most students will have a lot more like supplemental essays to write. So there's maybe not enough time to consistently tweak or constantly adjust the personal statements for each school, right? So you'll find that it's going to be a big constraint in terms of your time. Rarely do I feel the need to do that anyway. Now, of course, if let's say, for example, you sent in an application for early schools and you realize later on some ideas about fine tuning it, that's fair game, right? You can modify your Common App essay for the next batch that you're sending in for regular decision. Okay. All right. I think I have time for maybe a couple more here. So one is very, very specific in terms of SAT scores here. It says my SAT verbal score or English score is 770. And I just found out that would be bucket B for Caltech, bucket A is 780 to 800. My math is 800. What important is it to, how important is it to get honestly, I'm not even sure where you're getting this bucket stuff from, right? Yeah, so it's a little bit more like fluid than that, right? So 1570 is a tremendous score, and it's probably going to be very close to the 75th percentile score. So I wouldn't necessarily focus on like these buckets per se. I would just look at how your score adds up in terms of the percentiles for Caltech. So I would still say that that would be a very, very competitive score. I wouldn't feel the need to go ahead and take it one more time, to be honest, if you're at that level. Usually 35 ACT, 1570 SAT. At that stage, they're not going to quibble over 10 points. It just doesn't seem like a good investment of your time, in my opinion. Okay. Um, Next, or I guess this will be our final question for the evening here, right? Shall I group extracurricular activities based on certain categories, groups of activities together related to academic, and then a few for volunteering? No, don't do that, please. Go with whichever, like you have to have a strategy in terms of prioritizing which activities you want to put as your most important, the ones you're most passionate about. Um, don't try to cluster them together in the Common App, right? In terms of things that are just related to each other, because you want to put your best foot forward in terms of the activities that would be most impressive. Those should actually go up top because it's sort of like the same logic for when you're uh, putting together a resume for a job, right? You want your most relevant, your most impressive experiences and activities up top because that's what's going to grab their attention first. Okay. So there's not a lot of benefit, in my opinion, to clustering activities based on some shared theme or some shared, what do you call this, category. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. That was a lot of questions. I wasn't able to get to all of them, but if you join me again for a future session,